I want to start this conversation from a place of honesty, because pretending not to feel what I feel would be insulting to the gravity of what we all watched. When I finished that final episode of the documentary, I didn't just feel disappointed. I felt sick. I felt angry in a way that settles deep in your chest and stays there. And the more I replayed certain moments in my mind, the more one thing became painfully clear. We did not talk enough about one of the jurors who spoke publicly after this case. We focused heavily on one juror, and rightly so. But there was another voice in that room that deserved far more scrutiny than it received. A man who watched the same footage we watched. A man who heard the same testimony we heard. A man who saw a woman dragged through a hotel hallway, thrown around like an object, blocked from leaving, humiliated, frightened, and clearly powerless in that moment. And yet, after witnessing all of that, he described the relationship as two people in love. That alone is disturbing. But what made it unbearable was the analogy he chose to justify his thinking. He said it was like clapping hands together, that you cannot clap with one hand, that it takes two. Let that sink in. This was his conclusion after watching video evidence of physical violence. This was his explanation after hearing a pregnant woman cry through her testimony. This was his takeaway after listening to multiple women describe fear, coercion, manipulation, control, and long-term psychological damage. Two people in love. Clapping hands. That statement didn't just miss the mark. It erased the entire reality of what abuse looks like. It dismissed the power imbalance. It ignored the terror. It stripped the victim of her humanity and replaced it with a neat little metaphor that made the violence easier to digest. And that is what made me angry all over again. Because this was not a random comment from someone on the internet. This was not an uneducated opinion shouted into the void. This was a juror. Someone placed in a position of responsibility. Someone tasked with weighing evidence, testimony, and human suffering with care and seriousness. Someone whose mindset directly influenced the outcome of a case that will echo for decades. There is no version of this story where that response is acceptable. Even if someone wanted to reduce this situation to a domestic violence scenario alone, which it is not, because it goes far beyond that, his explanation would still be grotesquely inappropriate. No domestic violence expert, no survivor advocate, no trauma specialist would ever describe abuse as mutual clapping hands. Violence is not a dance. Control is not romance. Fear is not love. What we saw on that footage was not a disagreement between equals. It was not a heated argument that got out of hand. It was a man exerting physical dominance over a woman who was trying to escape. She was dragged. She was restrained. She was prevented from leaving. Her body language alone told the entire story. And still this juror sat there and concluded that she was not trafficked, that she was not kidnapped, that she was not coerced. This, despite her stating repeatedly that she was forced into situations she did not want, despite her saying she had to take substances, despite her describing long-term health consequences, despite her friends corroborating fear and desperation, despite multiple women breaking down on the stand while describing the same patterns of control and intimidation. And yet somehow, after absorbing all of that, this man landed on love. That is not confusion. That is not nuance. That is not critical thinking. That is a complete failure to understand power, abuse, and human behavior. And this is why it matters who sits on a jury. Because when people walked out of that courthouse smiling, many of us were confused. We couldn't understand how anyone could hear those testimonies and feel lighthearted afterward. But now, after hearing how at least one of those jurors framed what he saw, it makes sense. This was the mentality in that van. This was the lens through which the evidence was viewed. A lens that normalized harm and reframed violence as romance. A lens that blamed proximity instead of power. And I need to say this clearly. When someone watches a woman being beaten and explains it away with metaphors about love, that is not a difference of opinion. That is a lack of moral clarity. I am not interested in protecting feelings here. I am interested in telling the truth. That reasoning was unintelligent. It was careless. And it was dangerous. We have reached a point in society where calling out stupidity is treated as offensive, but allowing stupidity to shape justice is somehow acceptable. That is backwards. When people who lack critical thinking are placed in positions of authority, the outcomes are catastrophic. This is how victims are silenced. This is how abusers walk free. This is how injustice gets dressed up as objectivity. What disturbed me most is that this man felt comfortable saying this publicly. He believed it would be received well. He believed people would understand his logic. That alone tells you how normalized these ideas still are. And that should frighten all of us. Because if someone can watch undeniable footage of violence and still rationalize it as mutual affection, then the problem is not just one juror. The problem is a culture that has taught people to excuse power as passion and control as love. This is not about personal dislike. This is not about emotion clouding judgment. This is about recognizing when someone fundamentally misunderstands the difference between consent and coercion. And that misunderstanding had consequences. That is why I needed to start here. Because this mindset explains everything that followed. What makes this entire situation even more disturbing is not just what that juror said, but what his words represent. His statements are not isolated. They are part of a much larger pattern that we have seen for decades when it comes to powerful men and the women around them. This is how abuse survives. This is how it is excused. This is how it is repackaged as something softer, something easier to accept, something that allows people to sleep at night without confronting the reality of what they have just witnessed. When someone says, "It takes two," in a situation like this, they are not offering balance. They are erasing power. They are pretending that two people entered the situation with equal agency, equal safety, equal freedom to leave. That is simply not true here, and anyone paying attention knows it. Power changes everything. A man with wealth, influence, security, lawyers, staff, and an entire industry built around protecting his image does not exist on the same plane as a woman whose career, safety, finances, and reputation are tied directly to him. That imbalance alone makes the two people in love narrative collapse under the smallest amount of scrutiny. Love does not require fear. Love does not require force. Love does not require obedience. And love certainly does not involve dragging someone down a hallway while they try to escape. What frustrates me deeply is that this was all explained clearly during the trial. This was not vague. This was not hidden. This was not a situation where jurors had to guess or infer what was happening. They were shown evidence. They heard testimony. They watched people break down emotionally while describing the same patterns again and again. Yet somehow, this juror walked away believing that all of it could be summarized with a metaphor about clapping hands. That is not interpretation. That is avoidance. It takes a very specific kind of mindset to witness suffering and immediately search for a way to neutralize it, to reduce it, to make it feel less severe. And often, that mindset comes from people who have never had to fear someone more powerful than themselves. For those who have lived long enough to recognize patterns, this should feel familiar. We have seen this before. Powerful men are protected not just by institutions, but by everyday people who are willing to explain away what is right in front of them. People who would rather believe a comforting lie than confront an uncomfortable truth. This is how victims end up questioning their own reality. Imagine hearing that explanation if you were the woman in that video. Imagine knowing that your pain, your fear, your humiliation was interpreted as love. Imagine realizing that the people responsible for deciding justice believed that you were equally responsible for your own suffering. That kind of dismissal leaves scars far deeper than physical injury. And this is why it matters that we talk about it openly. Because silence allows these ideas to remain unchallenged. Silence allows people like this juror to walk away believing they were reasonable, logical, even fair-minded. They were not. What makes this especially painful is that this was not just one woman's story. Multiple women testified. Multiple accounts aligned. The same behaviors, the same manipulation, the same environment of fear and control appeared again and again. That consistency matters. It is one of the strongest indicators of truth in any investigation. And yet, even with that consistency, the conclusion reached by this juror was that these women were simply part of a mutual, loving dynamic. That level of denial does not come from evidence. It comes from worldview. There is also something deeply troubling about how casually this explanation was offered. There was no gravity in his tone, no acknowledgement of the violence, no recognition of the trauma described. Just a neat analogy meant to shut the conversation down. That casualness is revealing. It suggests that for him, the suffering of these women never fully registered as real. It remained abstract, conceptual, something to be debated rather than something to be felt. And when human suffering becomes theoretical, justice becomes impossible. This is why so many survivors choose not to come forward. Not because they lack courage, but because they understand exactly how their experiences will be reframed. They know that someone will always find a way to blame them, to minimize what happened, to suggest that they played a role in their own harm. And in this case, that someone was a juror. That should alarm everyone. Because jurors are supposed to represent reason, fairness, and impartiality. They are meant to rise above personal bias and evaluate facts with care. When that system fails, it is not just one case that suffers. It sends a message far beyond the courtroom. It tells victims that evidence is not enough. It tells survivors that pain can be rationalized away. It tells powerful people that accountability is negotiable. And that brings me to something else that has been weighing heavily on my mind: the way people reacted afterward. The smiles, the lightness, the lack of visible discomfort. At the time, it was confusing. It didn't match the severity of what had been presented. But now, in light of these comments, it makes sense. If this was the mindset guiding deliberations, then the outcome was never going to reflect the reality of the harm described. This is not about revenge. This is not about wanting someone punished at all costs. This is about acknowledging truth when it is placed directly in front of us. And in this case, truth was offered repeatedly, clearly, and painfully. The failure was not a lack of information. The failure was a lack of willingness to see. There is also a broader societal issue at play here. We have reached a point where confidence is often mistaken for intelligence. Where someone speaking firmly, even foolishly, is treated as credible simply because they sound sure of themselves. That juror spoke with certainty, but certainty does not equal understanding. We need to stop confusing the two. Because when people who lack the tools to properly assess harm are given authority, the consequences ripple outward. They affect not just the individuals in the case, but everyone watching, listening, and learning what the system values. And right now, what this suggests is deeply unsettling. It suggests that some people can witness brutality and still frame it as romance. It suggests that power can override empathy. It suggests that accountability can be talked away with metaphors. That is not justice. That is failure. And it is exactly why this conversation cannot end with one documentary, one verdict, or one news cycle. Because until these underlying attitudes are confronted, the outcomes will keep repeating themselves. Different names, same results. That is the truth many people do not want to face. As powerful and necessary as this documentary was, there is another layer to this conversation that must be handled with care and honesty. Because while the emotional impact was undeniable, and while much of what was presented aligns with testimony, evidence, and long-standing allegations, it is also true that no documentary, no matter how well produced, should ever be treated as absolute truth without scrutiny. That does not weaken the case against abuse. It strengthens our integrity. Journalism is not about choosing sides. It is about accuracy. And when we allow emotion alone to guide belief, we risk replacing one form of manipulation with another. That is not justice. That is reaction. This is why the discussion raised by independent journalists matters. Not because it defends anyone accused of wrongdoing, but because it reminds us that facts must stand on their own, without exaggeration, assumption, or personal agendas shaping the narrative. There are elements within this four-part series that deserve praise. The courage of the women who spoke. The willingness to show disturbing footage rather than sanitize it. The way power dynamics were laid bare. All of that was important. All of that was needed. But there were also moments that did not sit right when examined closely. Some claims were presented as fact without sufficient evidence. Some timelines felt unclear. Certain financial assertions were made without documentation to support them. And when those gaps appear, they matter, especially in a case already charged with emotion and public outrage. One example that stands out is the discussion surrounding estates and financial responsibility. Claims were made about who paid for what, when, and why, yet public records do not clearly support those assertions. When such statements are left unchallenged, they open the door for critics to dismiss the entire project as biased, even when much of it is grounded in truth. And that is the danger. When inaccuracies slip into serious reporting, they do not just affect credibility. They give powerful people exactly what they want, an excuse to discredit everything else. They allow defenders to point at one questionable detail and say, "See? None of this can be trusted." That does a disservice to victims. It is possible, necessary even, to hold two truths at once. One, that this documentary played a vital role in exposing patterns of abuse and control. And two, that parts of it require correction, clarification, or further verification. Acknowledging that does not make someone pro-anyone. It makes them honest. Unfortunately, honesty has become rare. We are living in a time where media is often driven by funding, rivalry, and personal grievance. Where narratives are shaped not just by evidence, but by who stands to gain from telling the story a certain way. That does not mean everything is false. It means we must stay alert. The truth does not need embellishment. The truth does not need shortcuts. And the truth does not need to be rushed. When journalists allow personal dislike, professional rivalry, or financial motivation to influence reporting, they undermine the very cause they claim to support. And in cases like this, where trauma is involved, that is unacceptable. This is why careful analysis matters. It is also why we must separate emotional reaction from factual assessment. Anger can coexist with clarity. Outrage can coexist with discipline. We do not have to abandon critical thinking to stand with victims. In fact, victims deserve our best thinking, not our loudest reactions. The problem arises when people treat documentaries as final verdicts rather than starting points for deeper investigation. A film can open eyes, but it cannot replace due process. It can highlight patterns, but it cannot fill in every gap. And when viewers forget that, they risk being misled, intentionally or not. This does not negate the suffering described. It does not erase the footage. It does not invalidate testimony. But it does mean that responsible conversation requires acknowledging where the storytelling may have overreached. And that is something mature audiences understand. Those who have lived long enough know that truth is rarely simple, that real life is messy, that even necessary projects can be flawed, and that holding media accountable is part of protecting the very people we claim to care about. There is also something deeply concerning about how quickly nuance is now treated as betrayal. The moment someone points out a factual inconsistency, they are accused of defending the accused. That kind of thinking shuts down meaningful dialogue and turns complex issues into moral shouting matches. That helps no one. What we should be striving for is balance. Firm condemnation of abuse alongside firm commitment to accuracy. Emotional resonance paired with factual discipline. Compassion without compromise. Because if we allow false or exaggerated claims to stand, we weaken the credibility of real ones. And in the long run, that harms survivors far more than it helps them. This is not about protecting reputations. This is not about softening narratives. This is about preserving truth. And truth must be strong enough to withstand scrutiny. If parts of this documentary are inaccurate, they should be corrected. If certain claims lack evidence, they should be questioned. That does not erase the rest of the work. It strengthens it. The goal should never be to win an argument. The goal should be to understand reality as clearly as possible, especially when lives, trauma, and justice are involved. That level of care is not optional. It is required, because when facts matter, precision matters. There is one final issue that cannot be ignored because it connects directly to everything we have been talking about: power, protection, and the failure of adults to draw clear boundaries. And that is the growing normalization of children being placed into public, highly exposed digital spaces long before they are old enough to understand the consequences. Seeing a 12-year-old with a public Instagram account, labeled managed by parents, should give every adult pause. Not because of who the child is, but because of what the platform represents. Social media is not neutral. It is not harmless. It is a space driven by algorithms, attention, profit, and access is the most dangerous part of all. A child does not need millions of eyes on them. A child does not need strangers observing their growth. A child does not need their image turned into a product. And yet we continue to pretend that parental management somehow removes all risk. It does not. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a child's presence online can be justified by fame or wealth. Money does not eliminate danger. Influence does not replace maturity. And access, once granted, cannot be taken back. We have seen, time and time again, how adults exploit proximity to children under the guise of admiration, opportunity, or mentorship. We have seen the damage that results when boundaries are blurred and when children are treated as extensions of brands rather than individuals in need of protection. The uncomfortable truth is this: once a child enters that world, they do not leave it. Their image becomes searchable. Their presence becomes permanent. Their childhood becomes content. And history has already shown us where unchecked access can lead. When we look back at scandals involving powerful adults and vulnerable young people, one of the most common threads is exposure without protection. Children placed in environments they did not choose, surrounded by adults who did not have their best interests at heart, all justified by status, success, or opportunity. That is why this matters. This is not about one family. This is not about one celebrity child. This is about a culture that has become dangerously comfortable with putting minors on display. A culture that mistakes visibility for empowerment and access for opportunity. Some countries have begun to recognize this risk and are taking steps to limit social media use for minors. That is not censorship. That is protection. It is an acknowledgement that childhood is not something to be rushed, monetized, or sacrificed for relevance. A child deserves privacy. A child deserves safety. A child deserves time to grow without scrutiny. Once that line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. What makes this especially concerning is how quickly people normalize it. How easily adults justify following, watching, and engaging with accounts belonging to children. That should never feel normal. That should always raise alarm. There is nothing harmless about a world where grown adults have access to the daily lives of minors through screens. We have already seen how that access has been abused in the past. Pretending it will not happen again is not optimism. It is denial. And denial is exactly what we have been talking about throughout this entire conversation. Denial of abuse. Denial of power imbalances. Denial of responsibility. It is all connected. When adults fail to protect women, fail to protect children, and fail to hold powerful people accountable, the damage compounds. It spreads. It becomes cultural. And eventually it becomes normalized. That is why speaking up matters, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is unpopular, even when it means calling out ignorance, recklessness, or poor judgment. This is not about outrage for the sake of outrage. This is about drawing lines where lines should have always existed. Justice requires clarity. Protection requires boundaries. And truth requires courage. We cannot continue to excuse harmful behavior by reframing it as love, opportunity, or misunderstanding. We cannot continue to hand-wave serious concerns because confronting them would disrupt comfort or image. And we cannot keep asking victims, whether women or children, to pay the price for adult failure. If there is one thing that this entire discussion has made clear, it is this. Systems fail when the wrong people are given power, platforms, or influence without accountability. That applies in courtrooms. That applies in media. And that applies in homes. Until we start taking that seriously, the outcomes will not change. And that is the hardest truth of all. I want to end this by saying something very plainly. None of these conversations are happening because people enjoy being angry. They are happening because silence has consequences. When harmful thinking goes unchallenged, it does not fade away. It settles in, it spreads, and it shapes outcomes that affect real lives. What we saw in that courtroom, what we heard from that juror, and what we watched in that documentary should trouble anyone who believes in fairness, accountability, and basic human dignity. Not because every detail was perfectly presented, but because the larger pattern is impossible to ignore. Power was minimized. Harm was reframed. Responsibility was blurred. And that is how injustice survives. Calling out ignorance is not cruelty. It is necessary. When someone in a position of authority demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of violence, consent, and power, that should never be brushed aside as just an opinion. Opinions do not belong in places where lives are being weighed. Competence does. We owe it to survivors to be precise, honest, and brave. That means condemning abuse without hesitation while also demanding accuracy from the media that covers it. It means refusing to excuse dangerous thinking simply because it is spoken calmly or confidently. And it means protecting children before harm occurs, not after. There is nothing progressive about exposing minors to adult spaces. There is nothing loving about excusing violence. And there is nothing fair about allowing those with poor judgment to shape justice. This is not about picking sides. This is about choosing standards. Standards for jurors. Standards for journalists. Standards for parents. Standards for all of us. If we want better outcomes, we have to demand better thinking. We have to stop confusing comfort with truth and confidence with intelligence. And we have to remember that protecting the vulnerable is not optional. It is the bare minimum of a functioning society. That is why this conversation matters. That is why it cannot be dismissed. And that is why it should not be forgotten. Because the cost of ignoring it is far too high.